Imagine a whisper. A quiet word, spoken in hushed tones, that could rip apart a life, shatter a family, and ultimately condemn an innocent soul to the most agonizing of deaths. For centuries, across the towns and villages of Europe, and even stretching to the nascent colonies of the New World, this whisper could carry a power more devastating than any army: the accusation of witchcraft. This wasn't merely superstition, it was a deep-seated terror, a societal paranoia that consumed communities, twisted legal systems, and ultimately led to the burning of countless men and, predominantly, women, on pyres fueled by fear and ignorance. Today, we delve into one of the darkest, most tragic chapters of Western history, the European witch hunts. These weren't isolated incidents of mob violence, but rather systematic campaigns of persecution, sanctioned by both church and state, that reveal a chilling portrait of collective hysteria, warped justice, and the devastating consequences when fear triumphs over reason. We'll explore not just the horrific fates of those accused, but the twisted logic that condemned them, the methods used to extract confessions, and the deep societal anxieties that birthed this terrifying phenomenon. For in understanding this era of unimaginable cruelty, we confront fundamental questions about power, truth, and the enduring shadows of human prejudice. Our journey into this terrifying landscape begins in the small, unassuming German town of Bamberg in the early 17th century. It was a time of immense upheaval, religious strife, economic hardship, and the lingering scars of the 30 Years' War had left communities vulnerable and suspicious. Into this crucible of anxiety stepped Prince Bishop Johann George II Fuchs von Dornheim, a man whose zeal for rooting out heresy would earn him the chilling moniker, the Hexenbischof or Witch Bishop. Under his oppressive rule, Bamberg became a chilling epicenter of the witch trials. Consider the tragic case of Johannes Junius, the mayor of Bamberg. A respected and wealthy man, he was hardly the stereotypical image of an outcast or an old, frail woman often targeted. Yet, in 1628, he was arrested. His crime? Accused by others under torture, his name was dragged into the expanding web of supposed witches. Imagine the scene: a man of his standing, stripped of dignity, subjected to the most brutal interrogations. He was put to the thumbscrews, a device that slowly crushed his fingers, then the leg screws, designed to shatter the bones of his shins. But the ultimate torment, the one that truly broke him, was the strapado, where he was hoisted by his bound hands, dislocating his shoulders again and again. Through it all, Junius maintained his innocence. For weeks, he endured, clinging to the truth. But the methods of the witch hunters were designed to break even the strongest will. The Malleus Maleficarum, or Hammer of Witches, a notorious guide for witch hunters, openly endorsed torture as a legitimate means to extract confessions. It stipulated that pain was necessary, for the devil would not allow his servants to confess willingly. And so, the torment continued until, finally, Johannes Junius, a man of standing and integrity, capitulated. He confessed. He admitted to meeting the devil, to engaging in unholy acts, to everything his torturers demanded. Before his execution, he managed to smuggle a letter to his daughter, Veronica. It was a desperate, heartbreaking plea, written in secret, detailing the unspeakable torments he had endured. He described how he was forced to name others, how he himself was a victim, compelled to lie to escape further agony. "Dearest child, you know that I am innocent," he wrote. "They know nothing but what I have told them." His confession, extracted under such duress, became the very evidence used to condemn him. On August 6, 1628, Johannes Junius, the former mayor, was burned alive. His story, etched in that smuggled letter, remains a harrowing testament to the injustice and systematic cruelty that defined the witch hunts. The fear in Bamberg was palpable, a suffocating blanket that settled over every household. No one was safe. If a respected mayor could be accused, tortured, and executed, what hope was there for anyone else? The accusations fed upon themselves, a terrifying chain reaction where each forced confession led to new denunciations, expanding the net of terror wider and wider. Neighbors turned on neighbors, families were torn apart by suspicion, and the most arbitrary misfortunes, a sudden illness, a failed harvest, a cow's unexplained death, were attributed not to natural causes, but to the malevolent influence of a witch. And as this fear intensified, the legal processes, already biased, became even more grotesque, transforming into instruments of pure terror. The terror of the witch hunts was not confined to a single town or region. It swept across Europe like a plague, infecting the minds of ordinary people and manipulating the very structures of justice. As the 17th century wore on, the fear of hidden pacts with the devil escalated, fueled by printed pamphlets and influential treatises like the infamous Malleus Maleficarum. This hammer of witches served as a horrifying manual for judges and inquisitors, detailing how to identify, interrogate, and ultimately convict those accused of witchcraft. It presented a chillingly rational framework for irrational beliefs, transforming superstition into codified law. One of the most insidious aspects of these trials was the swimming test, or water ordeal. It was rooted in the perverse belief that pure water, being an element of God, would reject those who had consorted with the devil. The accused, typically a woman, would have her thumbs bound to her toes, then be thrown into a body of water, a pond, a river, or even a specially constructed tank. If she sank, she was considered innocent, though often, by then, it was too late, and she drowned. But if she floated, buoyant on the surface as if rejected by the pure element, it was seen as irrefutable proof of her guilt, a sign that the devil's mark made her unnaturally light. The outcome, therefore, was a tragic paradox, either death by drowning or death by fire. Imagine the psychological torment of such an ordeal. To be stripped, bound, and cast into the freezing water, knowing that either outcome meant your demise. The fear, the desperate struggle for breath, the cold seeping into your bones, all under the gaze of a fervent, often hostile crowd, convinced of your inherent evil. It wasn't just a physical test, it was a public shaming, a dehumanizing ritual designed to strip the accused of their last vestiges of humanity before their final, horrifying punishment. The crowd, caught in the grip of mass hysteria, would often cheer the guilty outcome, their fear momentarily assuaged by the supposed triumph over evil, their anxieties projected onto a vulnerable scapegoat. Beyond these crude methods, the legal systems themselves were grotesquely distorted. Normal legal protections were suspended for those accused of witchcraft, deemed crime in exceptum, an exceptional crime that justified exceptional procedures. Hearsay was accepted as evidence, dreams and visions were given legal weight, and the testimony of children, often coerced or confused, could send an adult to the stake. The accused had no right to legal counsel, and their accusers remained anonymous, shielding them from reprisal or scrutiny. It was a system rigged for conviction, where the very act of accusation created an almost inescapable vortex of suspicion and condemnation. Consider the stark contrast to modern justice. We speak of innocent until proven guilty, of rights to representation, of the careful scrutiny of evidence. But in the age of the witch hunts, the unspoken rule was often guilty until proven innocent, and even then, innocence was a precarious state, often overridden by the weight of public opinion, a fervent magistrate's conviction, or the sheer agony of torture. The symbolism of the punishments was equally chilling. Burning at the stake, the preferred method in many parts of continental Europe, was not merely a way to kill, it was a purification ritual. Fire was believed to cleanse the soul, to burn away the demonic taint, ensuring that the witch's corrupted spirit could not linger and continue its malevolent work. It was a religious act, performed with the full weight of ecclesiastical and secular authority, a theatrical display of righteousness intended to reinforce social order through terrifying example. These brutal executions were not hidden away, they were public spectacles, drawing large crowds, often held in town squares or on prominent hillsides. The burning pyre, the screams, the rising smoke, these were lessons etched into the collective memory, stark warnings of the consequences of deviation, dissent, or simply being different. The fear was a powerful tool of social control, keeping communities in line, discouraging individual thought, and reinforcing rigid moral codes. It allowed authorities to consolidate power, deflect blame for societal woes, and maintain a precarious sense of order in tumultuous times. And yet, beneath the veneer of righteous fury, lay a deep current of injustice, a systematic cruelty that would haunt the conscience of later generations, once the smoke finally cleared. As the 17th century wore on, the witch hunts reached their horrific zenith, particularly in regions racked by religious conflict and economic hardship. While thousands perished across continental Europe, often in anonymity, some cases pierced through the mists of time, revealing the sheer scale of the tragedy and the profound human cost of such widespread delusion. The accusations weren't always born of malice. Sometimes they stemmed from genuine fear, a desperate attempt to understand inexplicable misfortune in a world without scientific explanation for disease, crop failure, or infant mortality. But fear, unchecked, quickly festered into outright paranoia. Consider the infamous case of the Salem witch trials in the Massachusetts Bay Colony in 1692. While the methods of execution there, hanging, not burning, differed from Europe, the underlying hysteria and the destructive power of accusation remained terrifyingly consistent. It began with a few young girls exhibiting strange fits, convulsions, and uncontrollable outbursts, symptoms that, in a world steeped in Puritan theology, were immediately attributed to witchcraft. These girls, often encouraged and believed by their elders, began to name names. And once a name was spoken, the individual was ensnared in a legal trap from which escape was almost impossible. Martha Corey, a respected 71-year-old woman, was one such victim. Known for her independent spirit and occasional skepticism of the accusers, she quickly became a target. Her crime was her very demeanor, her questioning gaze, her quiet dignity, which was interpreted as defiance, as the mark of a hardened witch. When brought before the magistrates, her every movement, her every word, was twisted into evidence against her. If she trembled, it was because the devil was within her. If she stood firm, it was proof of her supernatural resistance. Her husband, Giles Corey, an 80-year-old farmer, also found himself accused. When he refused to plead guilty or innocent, understanding the futility of the process, he was subjected to peine forte et dure, a brutal form of torture where heavy stones were piled upon his chest until he either entered a plea or was crushed to death. Giles Corey died after 2 days of this agonizing pressure, the only person in the Salem trials to be pressed to death, an act of defiant martyrdom against a system that offered no true justice. Martha, his wife, was hanged weeks later, on September 22, 1692, alongside 7 others, on the infamous Gallows Hill. The Salem trials, though smaller in scale than some European purges, remain a chilling microcosm of the broader witch hunt phenomenon. They illustrate how quickly a community can descend into madness, how easily fear can outweigh reason, and how quickly ordinary citizens can become both persecutors and victims. The supposed evidence was often spectral evidence, the testimony of the accusers claiming to see the spirits of the accused tormenting them. This was impossible to refute, as only the accuser could see the tormentor, making any denial futile. The sheer weight of mass hysteria, fueled by religious fervor and societal anxieties, created an environment where accusation was tantamount to conviction. But, mercifully, the darkest days of the witch hunts eventually began to recede. The sheer number of executions, the growing skepticism among some legal scholars and theologians, and the blatant injustices became impossible to ignore. In some places, such as Scotland, witch hunts continued longer than in other parts of Europe, but slowly, the tide turned. Legal reforms were implemented, often by enlightened individuals who recognized the grave miscarriages of justice. The very idea of spectral evidence came under scrutiny, and confessions extracted under torture were increasingly deemed unreliable. The Enlightenment, with its emphasis on reason and empirical evidence, played a crucial role in dismantling the intellectual framework that had sustained the hunts for so long. These weren't just punishments. They were messages etched in blood, meant to control a society through terror, to enforce conformity, and to excise what was perceived as an existential threat. But the legacy of the witch hunts transcends the methods of execution or the specific cases. It stands as a stark, enduring warning about the dangers of unchecked fear, the fragility of justice in the face of mass hysteria, and the terrifying ease with which we can demonize and destroy those we deem other. It reveals how easily societal anxieties can be projected onto vulnerable groups, and how quickly basic human rights can be discarded when collective panic takes hold. What can we learn from these darkest chapters? Perhaps that the seeds of paranoia and prejudice, though dormant, always lurk beneath the surface of society. That critical thinking, empathy, and the unwavering defense of individual rights are not just abstract concepts, but vital bulwarks against the return of such horrors. The screams from the pyres and the chilling whispers of accusation may have faded into history, but their echoes serve as a perpetual reminder of what can happen when we lose our way, when we forget the fundamental value of every human life, and when we allow fear to dictate justice. We invite you to reflect on these stories, to consider the lessons they offer, and to share your own thoughts in the comments below. What aspect of the witch hunts do you find most disturbing? What do you believe truly brought an end to this terrifying era? And what responsibility do we, in the present, have to remember these dark corners of history? If these forgotten stories from history's darkest corners fascinate you, remember to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more journeys into the unsettling past. We've journeyed through the chilling mechanics of the witch hunts, from the instruments of torture that broke bodies and spirits to the societal anxieties that fueled the pyres. But to truly grasp the profound tragedy of this era, we must also confront the sheer scale of the terror, the vast numbers of individuals who were swept up in this maelstrom of accusation and condemnation. While precise figures are debated by historians, it is estimated that tens of thousands, predominantly women, met their horrific end as accused witches across Europe. This wasn't just a series of isolated incidents, it was a devastating demographic phenomenon, leaving scars on communities for generations. The hunt for witches often followed discernible patterns, flaring up in waves, sometimes intensified by the arrival of zealous witch-finders. One such figure was Matthew Hopkins, the self-proclaimed witch-finder general of England, operating in the mid-17th century during the chaos of the English Civil War. This period of intense social and political upheaval provided fertile ground for suspicion and fear, and Hopkins exploited it with ruthless efficiency. He wasn't a magistrate or a theologian, but a cunning entrepreneur of terror, charging towns exorbitant fees for his services. He and his associates would arrive in a village, immediately fostering an atmosphere of intense suspicion, promising to rid the community of its perceived evil. Hopkins' methods, though lacking the overt physical torture of continental Europe, were psychologically devastating. He relied heavily on watching, keeping the accused awake for days, depriving them of sleep, often with uncomfortable positions, until they were delirious and disoriented. He also employed pricking, where a sharp needle would be used to find a witch's mark, a supposed insensitive spot on the body where the devil had left his sign. Any mole, wart, or blemish could be interpreted as such a mark, and if the pricking caused no pain or bleeding, often due to the use of blunted needles or clever sleight of hand, it was deemed proof of guilt. The sheer psychological pressure, the sleep deprivation, and the constant badgering were often enough to elicit false confessions from desperate, exhausted individuals. One of Hopkins' most notorious victims was John Lowes, an 80-year-old vicar from Brandeston, Suffolk. Despite his advanced age and respected position, he was accused of witchcraft by members of his own congregation. The charges were flimsy, based on a few unexplained misfortunes and the testimony of others who had already been implicated by Hopkins. Lowes was subjected to the watching ordeal, kept awake for 3 days and 3 nights, constantly questioned and harassed by Hopkins' men. In his state of extreme exhaustion and disorientation, he eventually confessed to having a familiar spirit in the form of a ferret and sending it to sink a ship. His confession, extracted under such duress, sealed his fate. John Lowes was hanged in Bury Street, Edmonds in 1645, one of many victims of Hopkins' brief but brutal reign of terror across East Anglia. The story of John Lowes, a man of God brought down by manufactured evidence and psychological torment, highlights a crucial point: no one was truly safe. The witch hunts consumed the rich and poor, the young and old, men and women from all walks of life. The accusations were often opportunistic, settling old grudges, seizing property, or simply deflecting blame during times of hardship. The fear became a self-perpetuating cycle, where accusers gained power, and silence was often interpreted as complicity. Beyond the specific individuals, these hunts left an indelible mark on the societal fabric. Communities were torn apart by suspicion, trust eroded, and a deep, collective trauma settled over regions that had experienced intense purges. The legal systems, having been twisted into instruments of terror, had to slowly, painfully, reform. The acceptance of spectral evidence and confessions under torture was gradually challenged, and the very concept of a widespread demonic conspiracy began to lose its hold on the collective imagination. It was a slow, arduous process, marked by judicial retractions, posthumous pardons, and, eventually, a quiet acknowledgement of the catastrophic injustices committed. The echoes of those trials, the memory of the innocent condemned, serve as a chilling testament to the fragility of justice when confronted by blind faith and overwhelming fear. The witch hunts, while devastating, did not last forever. As the 17th century drew to a close and the 18th century dawned, the fervent belief in widespread demonic conspiracies began to wane. This shift wasn't sudden, it was a gradual process, influenced by a confluence of factors that slowly chipped away at the foundations of the witch hunt hysteria. One of the most significant forces driving this change was the rise of Enlightenment thought. Philosophers and thinkers began to emphasize reason, empirical observation, and critical inquiry over superstition and unverified belief. Figures like John Locke and Voltaire championed skepticism and individual rights, fundamentally challenging the absolute authority that had underpinned the witch trials. The very notion of spectral evidence, once seen as irrefutable proof, was increasingly ridiculed by intellectuals and some within the legal establishment. How could one be convicted on testimony that could not be seen or verified by anyone else? This logical flaw, once ignored, became a glaring indictment of the trial's injustices. Furthermore, the sheer scale and indiscriminate nature of the persecutions began to sicken even some of the most zealous proponents. When respected members of the community, ministers, or even children began to be accused, doubts inevitably arose. The widespread suffering, the tearing apart of communities, and the blatant miscarriages of justice became undeniable. In many regions, the financial cost of the trials, the fees paid to witch finders, and the loss of productive citizens also started to weigh heavily on authorities. Legal reforms, though slow, also played a crucial role. Judges and legal scholars began to demand higher standards of evidence, rejecting confessions extracted under torture and discrediting the testimony of accusers who displayed questionable motives or unstable behavior. The notion that torture could produce false confessions became more widely accepted, a stark realization after centuries of its brutal application. Some rulers, recognizing the societal chaos and economic disruption caused by the hunts, began to issue edicts limiting their scope or outright banning certain practices. The last official executions for witchcraft in Europe occurred in the early to mid-18th century, though sporadic accusations and vigilante actions continued in isolated pockets for a time. Anna Goldie, executed in Switzerland in 1782, is often cited as the last person officially executed for witchcraft in Europe, her case a tragic echo of a receding nightmare. In America, the aftermath of the Salem witch trials led to widespread remorse and self-reflection. Jurors publicly apologized for their roles, reparations were eventually made to the victims' families, and the legal system underwent significant reforms to prevent such a catastrophe from ever happening again. The legacy of the witch hunts is profound and serves as a powerful cautionary tale for humanity. It reveals the terrifying consequences when fear, ignorance, and prejudice are allowed to coalesce and wield absolute power. It highlights the fragility of justice and the immense importance of due process, critical thinking, and the protection of individual liberties. These aren't just historical events, they are mirrors reflecting our own vulnerabilities, reminding us of the human capacity for both profound cruelty and, ultimately, the slow, difficult path towards enlightenment and compassion. What do these dark chapters reveal about the timeless struggle between belief and reason, or the enduring human tendency to seek scapegoats in times of crisis? How can we ensure that such collective delusions, in new forms, do not resurface in our own time? The echoes of the witch hunts remind us that vigilance, empathy, and a steadfast commitment to truth are our strongest defenses against the shadows of history.